Welcome to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Cameron Lawrence, and we are talking rookie, or I guess technically now sophomore wide receivers, and putting them into a tier list of what we expect from them moving forward. This is going to be a little more Dynasty focused. We're starting to dabble into that now that the season's over, but you redraft and basketball guys should for sure stick around too, because we'll be talking about their outlooks for next season. Before I jump in, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications because we got content coming for you all off season. We got recap, we got draft stuff, we got free agency, everything that you need to know. We're going to have podcasts coming out, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. But let's jump right in and start with our S-tier wide receivers. And the first S-tier wide receiver, the only S-tier wide receiver, is Puka Nacua. I don't think you can really argue with this. Wide receiver 4 on the season, 17.6 fantasy points per game, 105 receptions, a rookie record, 160 targets, 1,486 yards, a rookie record, and 6 touchdowns. Only 6 touchdowns, which is just surprising with the amount of volume he got, the way that Stafford trusted him on the season. He only had 6 games this season outside the top 30 wide receivers compared to 9 games inside the top 12. That is amazing as a rookie to have that sort of consistency to continually be top 12 and only have 6 of your 17 games where you finish outside the top 30. Cooper Kupp did come back and he slowed down a little at first, but after the bye, he only had 1 game under 7 targets, 5 of the 8 games with 80-plus yards, and he started to finally score more touchdowns. 4 of his 6 came after the bye when Cooper Kupp was back. He outplayed Kupp in their last playoff game, and you don't break these rookie single season records. Oh my goodness, could not get that out. In both receptions and yards is a fluke, right? He is here to stay. Puka Nacua is legit, and he is the only guy who has right now cemented himself in I could be a future superstar in the NFL. And on the top of all that, this dude was 6th in yards per hour run. He's out there. He's making things happen. Puka Nacua was amazing this year. And, yeah, he is our only player in the S tier. Real quick, before I transition to the A tier, I'm going to say some guys, and they're not in any order in particular. They're just all in the same tier. And we'll discuss what I think ceiling and floor for each of these players is. So our first A tier guy we're going to start with is Zay Flowers. He was a wide receiver 30 this last year, 12.9 fantasy points per game. He had over 100 targets, 77 receptions, and the yards were a little bit low. He had about 11 yards per catch, but you're not too worried about that. He saw pretty good volume throughout the year, but when Mark Andrews went down, we really saw Zay. Wide receiver 6'8", 103, obviously. Terrible week, that first week of the fantasy playoffs. But then 13 and 11, 5 weeks with double-digit targets this season. He had a couple right away, a couple at the end of the year. And I think what's different than other Ravens receivers we've seen, Hollywood Brown, Rashad Bateman, is that I don't think he has to be the second option. I think that Zay Flowers can be good enough, is good enough to challenge Mark Andrews to be more of a 1A, 1B. Right, with Hollywood, with Bateman, they were the clear number 2 in this offense, where I think Zay Flowers has the potential to be the 1B maybe behind Mark Andrews. He's shown even in his rookie year that he can be consistent. He's a playmaker in space. He's a great route runner. So yes, I think Zay Flowers can potentially be that high-end wide receiver 2, middle wide receiver 2 next season. I don't know if I see him for sure breaking into wide receiver 1 territory. I don't think he has the highest ceiling, mainly because of situation on this team, right? The Ravens are never going to throw for 4,500 yards as a team, but I do think he could be a very solid option moving forward. Our next player in the A tier is Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And let's be honest, if you drafted him, it was a disappointing year for fantasy. But you should have expected that, right? He's playing with DK. He's playing with Tyler Lockett. And a team that did switch towards the end of the year but did not play a lot of 3 wide receiver sets. But if you watched him, I mean, the way he was able to track the ball, what he was able to do when he had the ball in his hands, right? He did pass the eye test, but at the same time, he was only the wide receiver 48 with 8.8 points per game, only 4 top 25 finishes, 71st in snap share, so maybe a high wide receiver 3 in snap share. He was 6th in target separation, And you know what? There's going to be a lot of changes this next year in Seattle, so it's going to be interesting, right? This year to next year, he's the one that you're making the biggest bet on. We know the draft capital. We know what we saw in college. We saw flashes here. Now, can it translate? Can he get the opportunity this next season to put it all together, right? I think he's the biggest one that you're betting on, as far as we didn't necessarily see everything we wanted to see from him this season. But we, at the same time, think that he can really take that next step moving forward, because Pete Carroll's out as coach. Who knows what's going to happen, like with Tyler Lockett on this offense as he's getting older. So, yeah, I think that you're making the biggest bet on Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but I think that he showed just enough to keep himself in the A tier based off where he was drafted, what we expect from him, and what we saw this season. The third wide receiver in this A tier is Jordan Addison. He was the rookie wide receiver 2, wide receiver 23 with 13 points per game, 10 touchdowns, 70 receptions, 108 targets, 911 yards. He produced at a high level when Kirk was out there. In 5 of his 8 games with Kirk, he had 16 plus fantasy points. He was the wide receiver 11 with Kirk Cousins. Justin Jefferson played those first 4 games as well during that time. And he still had a wide receiver 1 overall finish without Kirk against the Bengals. He went 6 for 6 for 100 plus yards and 2 touchdowns. But it wasn't great. In the last 4 games that he played with Jefferson and Hockenson on the field, he only had 3, 6, 4, and 5 targets. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, is what does it look like when everybody is healthy, right? He didn't have Jefferson for most of the year. In the last game, he doesn't have Hockenson. But we know it sounds like Kirk is coming back to the Vikings. And obviously that makes a big difference when you're not having Jaron Hall, Nick Mullins, and Josh Dobbs throwing you the ball, and you have a legitimate quarterback throwing you the ball. So Jordan Addison had some great flashes, show that he's a good complement to Jefferson. It'll just be seeing, what kind of step does he take forward next year. I think that Jordan Addison has a slightly higher, because of the situation, again, ceiling than a Zay Flowers. Probably a similar ceiling. I still think JSN has this higher ceiling, but I think Jordan Addison has a much higher floor than a JSN. Our wide receiver 4 in the A tier is Tank Dell. And oh boy, did this guy flash. 15 points per game in only 11 full games, 47 receptions on 75 targets, 709 yards, and 7 touchdowns. 15 yards per catch. This guy was a threat when he was on the field. His last 4 games, he saw 11, 14, 10, and 8 targets with 5 total touchdowns and 2 games over 115 yards. Him and Stroud were on fire together, and him and Nico worked pretty well together when they were on the field. The thing for Tank Dell, right, we got to remember, he is still a tiny wide receiver as far as NFL standards go, 165 pounds, under 6 feet tall. So can he continue to play full seasons? How is that going to affect? Houston is a team that we could definitely see bring in another weapon to help on the offense. So how does that affect it? But, right, there's all these question marks. How does he come back from the injury? He should be fine, but, we said that with Tony Pollard this year. But what we saw from Tank Dell, what we saw with him and Stroud, especially in those last 4 games, was amazing, right? 5 total touchdowns, 2 games over 115 yards in those last 4, 11, 14, 10, and 8 targets, like I said before. The ceiling is huge for Tank Dell with a full season. We can see, if you see him 15 points per game from Tank Dell again next year, that's probably going to be a value for where he's going to be drafted, right? With the injury, with the fact that Nico played well at the end of the season, I don't think he's going to be at the Jordan Addison level at the probably this next guy we're going to talk about. He'll probably be around this next guy we're going to talk about. But I think that next year he could be the best value of all of these guys in drafts, because he's going to be slightly lower with the same type of ceiling. And the last guy in the A tier that we're going to talk about is Rashee Rice. Obviously, he has the best opportunity, right? He's the wide receiver 1 on the Kansas City Chiefs. Doesn't get much better than that. You're attached back from Mahomes with Andy Reid calling plays. Travis Kelce is only getting older. He's the wide receiver 27 with 13.3 points. And he could easily be a top 12 guy if they don't bring in someone next year. Down the stretch, he was fantastic. Since week 12, he had 8, 7, 9, 6, 5 receptions. He was top 15 in 4 of those 6 weeks. He was the wide receiver 6 during that stretch. And he had a great game against Miami in the playoffs as well, right? I think he scored 2 touchdowns. He had 79 receptions on the year, 102 targets. and he only had one game before the bye with 6 targets. So for him to finish as the wide receiver 27 and yet only have one game before his bye with 6 targets, that's impressive. It just shows how much he came on at the end of the year, how much they continued to utilize him, how much Patrick Mahomes started to trust him. He was easily, by far, it was not even close, the wide receiver 1 in this offense. And at the second half of the year, he was probably the number 1 target because Kelce just was not playing great. They're a team, like I said, with Houston. If Houston might bring in a weapon, Kansas City is almost definitely going to bring in a weapon after the way their offense was this year. However, Rashee Rice showed enough that he might still be the wide receiver 1 in this offense. The only thing that could maybe change that is a big free agent signing of T. Higgins, maybe Mike Evans, something like that. But, man, Rashee Rice played amazing. He has the upside. He showed you that he can be a target hog, finds the end zone. So he's got everything you want. He could easily, be closing in on, a top 15, top 12 wide receiver finish again next year. However, he has a little bit of a lower floor just because of the changes that could happen in this offense. But I still believe that Rashee Rice is going to be a good option. I believe that all 5 there. That's why they're in the A tier. All right, let's move on to the B tier now. We have Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. And I know some Packers fans might be, man, why the heck is he not in the A tier? Especially because he was a rookie wide receiver 3, 25 points, 13.7 points per game, only behind Tank Dell and Puka Nacua. So he played really well. 64 receptions, 94 targets, 793 yards, and 8 tutties. He added another 120 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. From week 10 on, he was the wide receiver 10 with 17.4 fantasy points per game, tied with Puka Nacua during that time. The biggest thing, the only thing against Reed right now, I shouldn't say the only thing, the biggest thing against Reed is Christian Watson missed most of that time, and in Christian Watson's 2 biggest games, Reed totaled 8 catches for 50 yards and a touchdown between those 2 games. That's the biggest if is, okay, Christian Watson's back. Is Jayden Reed the number 1 guy? Do they bring in somebody else to try and help out Jordan Love, right? There's all these different questions. Is Jayden Reed that guy? I think he is going to be a good wide receiver. I think he has as much of a ceiling as most of these guys ahead of him. Maybe not quite to the same, right? I don't think he's going to be a top wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 2 next season. But the floor is lower because what does it completely look like with Christian Watson? Is he going to be that complement? Could another guy we're going to talk about a little later, Dontayvion Wicks, is he going to be battling him for some of this stuff, right? There's a lot of wide receivers in Green Bay who started to kind of step up the season. That's why they're getting to where they are in the playoffs. But there's also a lot of wide receivers who are going to be taking targets that they could, and if they bring in somebody else. And we do have to acknowledge, right, Jordan Love has had one good year. Right, the way he looks right now, I am a Vikings fan. I don't want to be a hater. The way he looks right now, obviously, if he keeps this up, if he keeps going forward, right, they're going to have a good offense for many years to come. But we do have to acknowledge it's been one season. It's been one half of a season. So we'll see how it looks. But if it looks the way it is right now, right, Jordan Reed could make me look silly for putting him in Tier B. There is no one else in Tier B. We moved down to Tier C where we have Joshua Downs. He's a solid wide receiver, right? I think that's what we can give him. He was wide receiver 43, 9.2 points per game, 68 receptions, 98 targets, 771 yards. Obviously, there was no Anthony Richardson this year. So it remains to be seen, right, how he's going to flow with Richardson. He had Gardner Minshew. He played pretty well, and he's definitely the wide receiver 2 in this offense. Alec Pierce did not really challenge him for that, and Michael Pittman was obviously the alpha. And we do have to remember Michael Pittman is a free agent this season, so Michael Pittman could leave. I expect Michael Pittman to stay, but he could leave. It could change up. I don't think Josh Downs will ever be able to be the alpha guy. I think he needs to be a slot wide receiver 2, maybe play some on the outside, but I think that's where he's going to thrive, in the wide receiver 2 position. So hopefully, for his sake, Michael Pittman does return. He can take a slight step up. I expect him to be a flex guy moving forward, and end of, that wide receiver 2, maybe high-end wide receiver 3. Our next guy in Tier C, our only other player in Tier C, is Dontayvion Wicks. And you know what? This might just be my personal preference getting in the way. I do believe in Wicks. Wicks wasn't amazing this year. He was wide receiver 58 targets, 39 receptions for 581 yards and 4 touchdowns. I think that he has a lot of upside. I think that, he has shown the ability to go get the ball. The problem with Wicks is something that's similar to what I talked about Jayden Reed, right? If everyone's healthy, is he just the wide receiver 3? Can he challenge to move up to, wide receiver 2 land? He did end up with 2 top 20 finishes, 65% snap share in 3 of his last 4 games, and had 6+ targets in those games. And then 2 of them, like I said before, were top 20 finishes. So he has shown, when he's given the opportunity, he does produce. It's just how much opportunity is he continually going to be given? He did seem to beat out Romeo Doubs on the depth chart this season. So I think that he's another solid wide receiver. I think he's a guy who could be in that flex high-end wide receiver 3, maybe creep up to wide receiver. Or no, I think he's going to be a wide receiver 3. I'm not going to get ahead of myself next season. Maybe creep up to that high-end wide receiver 3, but more likely a flex consideration for next year. All right, I'm going to quickly talk about our D-tier wide receivers. I got 3 of them that we're going to talk about. Obviously, there could be more that fit in this tier, but I'm just going to talk about 3. First is Demario Douglas, 49 catches, 79 targets, 561 yards, and 561 yards and no touchdowns. He had 7.7 fantasy points per game. And look, right, he's going to be decent, but he is on the Patriots, so who knows what they get. They could take Jaden Daniels, Drake May, right? Could be in that conversation. They could go quarterback later, but it's not going to be Mac Jones, it seems like, at this point. So maybe an upgrade. Maybe he can kind of take that little step forward. He can potentially down the road be a guy who kind of Jacoby Myers-esque, where he like a sneaky wide receiver 2 season here or there. But that's really the ceiling I see for him. Is he'll be good. I think you might feel like he's underutilized in New England, but they do have, new coach, new regime going to come in. So there's a lot to be seen. I just don't think he has the same upside or the same floor really as any of these other guys. Quentin Johnston is the other guy in Tier D. You got to mention him. Draft capital alone, the opportunity with Keenan Allen, Mike Williams getting older, attached to Justin Herbert. Obviously, very disappointing. Not what you wanted to see. 38 catches on 67 targets for only 431 yards, 5.6 fantasy points per game was extremely disappointing. I don't want to write him off as a complete bust yet, but he is, one more season of this, and yeah, he's going to be definitely in that category. And the final guy we'll talk about is Michael Wilson. 38 catches, 58 yards, 58 targets, 565 yards, 8.8 fantasy points per game. Showed some flashes. I don't think he's going to end up, being a wide receiver 1. And especially if Arizona brings in, Marvin Harrison this next year, he's probably the wide receiver 3 behind Hollywood, and you got Trey McBride in that offense. So he'd be interesting in certain games with guys going down. If he can find his way into a wide receiver 2 role, he might be a little more interesting. But yeah, I think that Michael Wilson, Quentin Johnston, Demario Douglas have, flex as their ceiling right now. Maybe if, things start to change, maybe we can move them up a little bit. But they're who I have right now. That wraps up our tier list. If you disagree with any of these, please let me know. I would love to hear your reasoning behind it. If next week, Ty's going to bring you our running backs. We got our podcast coming out tomorrow, talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the top 15 running backs. So, yeah, that's where we're at. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications, and I will see you tomorrow on the podcast. Deuces.